This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast, where we talk about great movies and stories so great they should be movies. Find show notes, links to subscribe, and leave Apple Podcast reviews by going to our website, beyondthebigscreen.com. And now, let's go beyond the big screen.
All right, welcome back, guys. We are at it again. I am joined by Mustache Chris yet again, as always. And today, we're continuing our discussion of Crazy Joe Gallo. But we're going to talk about a particular issue that was sort of tangential, but running right up next to, or rather parallel maybe, but you get the drift. It was an issue that was running pretty close to what was going on with Crazy Joe Gallo, and that was the whole Italian Civil Rights League. And today, Mustache Chris and I are going to just do a little episode where we probably will wind up asking more questions than we answer in it. But we're going to have a little bit of fun with that. And maybe as one of the ways to wrap up this story of Crazy Joe and just this crazy time of the late 1960s and the early 1970s. I wonder, Mustache, what do you think just overall about this Italian American Civil Rights League?
Yeah, like as we were saying in the last episode, we were going to devote an entire episode to, like, I guess one of the most bizarre and fascinating moments in mob history, but I actually would say like modern American history, right? And by modern, I mean, I don't know, from 1940s on, I guess. Like, from what I've heard from everybody who's talked about the Italian Civil Rights League, like most people just can kind of dismiss it as like a crazy, idiotic idea that Joe Colombo came up with, but I mean, if you scratch beneath the surface a little bit, I think that's a pretty short-sighted way of looking at it. I actually think the Italian Civil Rights League was a pretty brilliant idea that, you know, maybe things had worked out differently could have actually saved the mob from the RICO charges that would be coming to them not long after these events.
I mean, it was brilliant on a lot of different levels, and we'll start to peel back those levels, and we could get into a whole thing. And we were playing around with the idea of really going and deep diving into the history of the sort of the discrimination against Italian immigrants and Italian Americans that really stretched all the way back into the 1800s. And it's really too big of a story for what we're going for today. But, you know, just the short story or the long story short, there's so much going on with this. I think people in, say, almost into the mid 21st century, it's hard to say that, like, how much of discrimination there was against Italian immigrants in the United States in the late 1800s and the 1900s, and really into the early World War II period.
Yeah, I mean, and just doing research on that, it's crazy to think that like Italian Americans as a group actually didn't reach the average economic level in comparison to the rest of the United States till I believe it was almost the 1960s, which is wild. It really is quite crazy. I mean, and there's like other examples of it. I mean, the biggest lynching that ever happened in the United States was in New Orleans. And it was done to Italians. I'm sure most people probably haven't heard about that. And in New York, yeah, there was like tons of discrimination. Italians were paid, even in comparison to newly arrived immigrants. I was kind of shocked to realize how little Italians were paid, say, in comparison to even the Irish and the Germans. They were getting paid less than the Irish, and the Germans were the ones getting paid the most, you know, and then even within their own group.
Yeah. And I think it because the Italians were really the first mass immigration of poorer immigrants who didn't speak English. There were some there, in the southern and the eastern United States, there was Mexican immigration, but it was really focused more in that area of the country. It wasn't a mass movement all throughout the country where these Italian Americans, they don't speak English. They're Catholics, like you said, the Germans, they came, but they were largely tradesmen. They were coming fairly wealthy, and they set up their own little colonies that they really prospered. They weren't going into the pipeline of these really menial jobs, coming poor, not a lot of education, didn't speak the language, and they weren't even the mainstream religion.
Yeah, I think one thing that kind of gave the Germans a big heads up is the fact that they were Protestant, right? I don't think people really kind of get how anti-Catholic America has been in its history. It seems like kind of a bizarre type of thing to us, but at the time, especially with Italians and the Irish, there was anti-Catholicism was a huge thing. This kind of stemmed from this belief that they were concerned that the Catholics took orders directly from the Pope in terms of how they voted and what have you. I mean, with every kind of conspiracy theory, there's a little bit of truth to that. So there was a reason to be worried, but it was way overblown. But that's a big part of it, is the Germans, for the most part, not all Germans, but the Germans that were coming over were Protestant, and had that similar type of religious outlook.
For me personally, I always, with history, you're better off looking at it from the perspective of the people who were living at the time, rather than taking our perspective these days and then putting it back on them. But I think that this is one in particular where you really have to be sitting there and saying, well, you're living in the 1960s. And like you said, that Italian American income is just catching up. Grandparents may have been involved in lynching type activities. Then in World War II, a lot of Italians had a rough time of it. And so you're sitting in 1960 and it looks a little less cynical to be talking about Italian American civil rights. So let's talk a little bit about how this league, Civil Rights League, was set up.
Yeah, so in April 1970, Joe Colombo set up the Italian Civil Rights League for, various reasons, but one that jumps out to me was to defend his son. And that's what I think. Joe Colombo Jr. had been caught melting down silver coins, which he would turn around and sell as silver ingots. Joe Colombo's senior claimed that the FBI has been harassing Italians all across the USA, and at one point he actually sent 30 to 50 picketers to the FBI headquarters on 3rd Avenue, 69th Street, and these picketers were there for weeks. Just protesting the FBI headquarters that was there.
I mean, that's pretty nuts. And you think about it, that, Joe Colombo, he's a mafia guy. He comes up with this. Maybe it is a scam, but you kind of have something going there that the FBI was into a lot of dirty, nasty stuff in the 1960s.
Yeah.
With, with all the things that they were doing with Martin Luther King and, all these civil rights leaders and all sorts of other people that just super, super corrupt and dirty things that the FBI was all over.
I mean, this to me is the brilliance of Joe Colombo's idea for the Italian Civil Rights League. I mean, he saw that could be used as like a offensive weapon against the FBI. In contrast to the commission, had been throughout pretty much its entire history, minus we talked a little bit about it where commission was especially during the Prohibition era, was willing to be a little bit more flagrant in terms of their attacking law enforcement. But throughout most of its history, it's taken the approach of the defensive. And basically there was kind of like an agreement, just stay low, stay out of the spotlight, never, directly confront the government or law enforcement. And basically the thought process is if we stay out of the picture or we don't make a big fuss of it, the state, the FBI will just kind of ignore us. To me, like that approach was just kind of buying time because you're basically prolonging a death, really, when you look at it. You have an organization that's a secret society that's set up to commit crimes and make money by committing these crimes. Of course, the FBI and the CIA, of course, the FBI and the government's going to go after you. It's just a matter of where they want to allocate their resources at a time, but eventually they're going to come around and get to you, which is exactly what happened. But if you take, like, say, Joe Colombo's approach, and why are you going to wait around for this to happen? If you just go right after them, you know what? Maybe it would have brought the mob down quicker. Who knows? But maybe it would have worked. Regardless, it's like, okay, so the commission's approach was just a slow death. But if you look at Joe Colombo's approach, there's the possibility that this crazy idea could have worked, or it would have failed. And maybe, I mean, it did fail, but we'll get into that a little bit later. But it would have failed in the sense of, maybe this would have turned the attention of the FBI more harshly on the mafia. But to me, it would be worth the risk, would it not, to try to take the offensive against the FBI if you're in the mafia? That's the way I would have looked at it.
Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors. I think if you try and look at it from the commission's perspective, the commission's a deeply conservative organization that they really do like a secret organization here. Let's keep this secret and let's just fly under the radar, do our scams, maybe, kind of put our tentacles into these private, legitimate businesses and, legitimize our criminal endeavors that way. But like you said, it's always, you can only hide for so long. If law enforcement and the government's going to come down on you and they want to come down on you, if you're a criminal organization, it doesn't matter if you're in legitimate businesses, they're going to find a way to unravel that.
Yeah, there's a theme here. If you guys have noticed in our previous episodes, I was kind of in support of Dutch Schultz taking out Thomas Dewey from the perspective of the mafia. And then in this situation, my approach is you're better off to attack as opposed to delaying the inevitable. That's kind of how I look at it. And if it works, it works. But I mean, you can delay and delay, but you're just kind of delaying the inevitable. I mean, I don't think there's any way for these guys to ever become like legitimate businessmen. I mean, they're criminals, like, to the core, right? And then the entire lifestyle requires you like to kill other people, too, right? Just to even get within this secret society. I get it from their perspective. It's like, well, I have all this money already, and as long as I can get to my grave without going to jail, great. Like, that's successful. But in terms of like long term, if you're looking at long term for the organization, I mean, like I said, you're just playing defensively. You're just delaying the inevitable. I recently just watched the movie All Quiet on the Western Front, and just thinking about it from like Germany's perspective, where for a long time, well, Germany would attack, but for a long time, like especially near the end of the war, like they were playing kind of like a defensive game and basically just delaying the inevitable. Like they would do like little attacks here and there and stuff like that, but like everyone kind of knew the writing was on the wall. Like there was really no way for them to win this war. It's kind of a little bit of a tangent, but it's very similar to how I think the mafia found themselves in this situation here. And it's easy to be like, well, we're doing this, and not seeing the big picture, right? That big picture wise, there's no way for you to win this conflict. So you got to do something outside of the box to try to win it.
Then that whole aspect of circling the wagons, that you can organize Italians as a political bloc and a bloc to fight against some of these cultural stigmas that were coming along this time of like the Godfather movie, which we may talk about soon, especially looking at it through that lens of anti-American feelings that would come across in the film. And just like the film that we talked about of the gang that couldn't shoot straight, like really over the top and almost like disgusting portrayals of Italian Americans. You could have really harnessed that. Somebody like Joe Colombo, even if it was completely cynically, he could have really harnessed it. But do you get the sense that it was completely cynical, at least from Joe Colombo's standpoint?
Maybe initially, No, I actually think I think Joe was a pretty smart guy. And in comparison to a lot of these other mob guys that we've talked about, I think Joe had the foresight to realize, like you pointed out, like circle the wagons. Like if we can get the entire Italian community behind us with this, it's going to become extremely difficult for the FBI to start infiltrating the mob and going after the mob, because you start throwing RICO charges and stuff like that around, and you get a full-fledged Italian civil rights movement behind you, ready to, protect any Italians. It's going to be almost next to impossible to do. I mean, look at how effective the ADL is. Look at how effective the Black Caucus is in the United States in terms of this. It's very difficult for the law enforcement to do anything really, right? Because once you get like a full-blown Italian civil rights league, and there's lawyers that come with that and everything, and pools of money, I truly believe this is how Joe, he saw it as a way. Maybe he did truly believe in this idea of Italian civil rights, and he thought Italians were being discriminated against. I think there was probably part of it was true. He saw it with his dad. He grew up with it too, right? But he also saw it as it's a very effective weapon that that the mafia could use against the FBI. So I think it's twofold.
And you really do see it, that like you have to separate it. Now there's groups like there's that anti-Catholic defamation league that's really more of just a grift to get onto Fox News. Like it's really not a thing where it had a very significant grift element to it, but that it could have been something that had a positive element to it as well. So what were some of the things that the Italian Italian Civil Rights League did?
Yeah, Joe Colombo and the Civil Rights League turned to economic and cultural institutions that they felt were disparaging Italian Americans. They actually forced the Ford Motor Company and Joe Colombo and his Civil Rights League, actually, they turned to economic and cultural institutions that they felt were disparaging against Italian Americans. They actually forced the Ford Motor Company and Elka Seltzer to remove ads that they felt were, there's no other way to put it, racist against Italians, which is no small thing. Like Ford Motor Company was, I mean, they're big now, but even back then they were massive. It's not like they were competing with Honda or anything like that. It was like Ford and GM and Dodge, right? one of the big car companies. They actually forced the Department of Justice to stop using the word mafia in official government documents. So, Civil Rights League, that a guy who is currently in charge of a mob family, always got to keep that in mind. He's in charge of the Colombo family. Set up this league on a whim really quickly and got the government to stop using the word mafia in official government documents. That's how crazy effective it was, just right off the bat. He also secured an agreement with Albert S. Ruddy. He was the producer of The Godfather, to omit the words mafia and La Cosa Nostra. And when you watch the movie again, it becomes very apparent once you know this information, that neither one of those words are used throughout the entire movie. I know it sounds bizarre. I guess most people would think like, oh yeah, of course they use the word mafia, but they don't throughout the entire movie. It is really bizarre because the whole movie is about the mob.
Yeah, that all of those things that they really did. I mean, again, I keep going through in my mind, is this just a cynical ploy, or are they doing, or is it silly? Does it really matter that Alka-Seltzer has an ad where the guy says, that's a spicy meatball? And I don't know what Ford's was, but I'm sure it's a caricature. And I wonder, if this is a question, if Joe Colombo fighting this thing, if it maybe got a lot of these companies to think about doing stereotypes of other sorts to stop them from doing that, then maybe they weren't, maybe they thought better about doing Chinese stereotypes or Asian stereotypes or other ones after that, because I would say that was pretty much that late 60s, early 70s was the high watermark of like general ethnic stereotypes being a commonplace thing.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, we saw when we watched that movie, the gang that couldn't shoot straight, and it was just like really ethnic based humor. I can kind of see like Italians going, you know what, I can laugh about myself a bit, but like this is a bit much. I mean, in terms of shutting companies down, I mean, making companies change directions. I mean, we don't have to look very far. I mean, look at cancel culture and look at what they've been able to do. I mean, you could look at the recent boycotts of, Budweiser, that conservatives have been doing.
Yeah.
It's cost them a lot of money, man. And I'm sure they're not going to do that again, whatever, what they did. They won't, because it just cost them too much money. So this type of stuff like boycotting and putting pressure on these companies, it works. It does work. It's one of the few things that actually does work in the States.
And so it has I don't know if you would say a meteoric rise, but it has a decent rise, but then it crashes pretty soon afterwards. What's the wrap up of the Italian American Defense League?
Yeah, so the second Italian Civil Rights League, I actually suggest you go on YouTube and you guys can watch both of the rallies. They're quite impressive, and even just me, I don't have an Italian background at all. I'm pretty, my background's Anglo from everything that I know of, almost 100% Anglo. Just watching these rallies with like Joe Colombo doing his speeches, like talking about like Italians being discriminated against and how they're not going to take it anymore, and like all the Italian flags and everything that was going on there and the bands. It's like I said, like me not being Italian, I was moved. I was like getting fired up watching, like, getting into the nationalistic spirit of the whole event. But at the second rally, we touched on this in the previous episode with the Joe Gallo IRL part 2. Joe Colombo was shot by Jerome Johnson 3 times, one time being in the head. And Joe was paralyzed and basically was in the hospital for 7 years. where he later died of cardiac arrest related to the shooting. But with that shooting and, for all intents and purposes, the death of Joe Colombo, the Italian Civil Rights League collapsed.
Do you think if Joe had a little bit longer, he could have gotten that a little bit more established? The whole idea.
Oh yeah, I think so for sure. I think he would have just kept on doing the rallies. The argument, I guess the argument could be so let's just say for argument's sake, the Italian Civil Rights League was a great idea, but it happened to be mishandled. Maybe Joe Colombo wasn't the right guy to be the front of it. Maybe they could have picked somebody else, like a Teamsters, I don't know, union rep or whatever, somebody who's just high ranking, respectable Teamster member, Italian or what have you, to be the head of this Italian Civil Rights League. And Joe Colombo ran in, in the shadows. I mean, they could have done that. I don't know. What's your opinion?
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors. It's just so hard to say with that. I think that the biggest thing is that it really did have to be led by somebody with the passion for it. Again, whether it was a legitimate passion or it was just completely to cover up for his mob activities. I think you needed somebody like Joe Colombo to carry that on, because at that point, Joe wasn't that old. He could have carried that on until the 80s or even the 90s and have still been relevant if he hadn't been shot.
Yeah, well, at the time when he became boss of the Colombo family, he was the youngest mob boss in the USA. Probably the world, I don't know, but I know for sure out of he was the youngest one. I believe he was, if I'm remembering correctly, I believe he was 40. So say he lives to 70. Yeah. He kept on, I don't know, maybe Joe could have slowly dipped out of the life, and then that became his thing. He just ran this Italian Civil Rights League that was also, a weapon and defense mechanism against this, from the state against the mafia too.
That could have very much changed the mafia too, of, either exposing it a lot quicker, that the people don't want to be associated with this criminal organization, or it could have morphed into something very different in a worse way. It would have been interesting to see if somebody like Joe Colombo could have lasted another 20 years after that. One thing I think is interesting is that you think about, that was the time of Martin Luther King is killed about 3-ish years earlier, and Robert F. Kennedy about 2 or 3 years earlier. Joe Colombo never I wonder if Joe Colombo was dead there, if he would have been turned into almost a civil rights martyr. That it was unlucky that he lived.
It's possible, but I don't know. It was a mob boss, right? I don't know. You know what I mean? People would have just kind of dug into his history, and where you can look at RFK and go, there's actually a respectable human being there. And obviously Martin Luther King, regardless of, the womanizing and what have you, you could look at Martin Luther King and go, that's somebody I actually do respect. I don't know if you can respect Joe Colombo in the sense that I believe he had foresight. He was determined. He was Machiavelli in the sense of how he betrayed his own boss. Respectable in the sense of oh, this guy could become a martyr. I don't know. I think that's going too far.
You don't think if he had actually died there, and with all the emotion that got whipped up, I think the way I'm trying to look at it is, was this just purely in the modern term AstroTurf?
Yeah.
Or was there something real there? I think another thing what do you think about, was this entirely AstroTurf? I can think of other, maybe AstroTurf isn't the best word for this term to apply to this, but that it didn't run very deep, that the people were excited about it, but as soon as there wasn't a strong organizing element around it, like with Joe Colombo, that people were just going to go off back to their daily lives.
And I think there's a bit of both to it. I mean, Joe Colombo, in the sense he's the one that started it. He's the one that ran the whole thing, right? And there was a lot of heavy mob influence in the sense of like a lot of like like a lot of the people at the rallies and stuff like that were part of unions that the mob controlled. But I think there was generally a belief among Italian Americans that they'd been hard done by, and nobody was talking about what happened to them. At the time, like everyone was talking about the injustices that had been done to blacks, and they were obviously much worse than what had been done to Italian Americans. But even at the time, like the poor, like how the Irish had to like fight so hard to get part of like respectable society in the United States. And I think a lot of Italian Americans being like, like I saw how my grandfather was treated. I saw how my grandmother was treated and for them. And I had to live with it myself, with, the Anglos or, like I guess the WASP elite looking down on me because I'm Italian and struggling to get into certain jobs or fitting into certain neighborhoods, and quite literally issues that are very similar to what was being talked about in terms of civil rights. I think that was legitimate within the Italian community. I'm sure many Italians felt like that.
I think another thing that was going against the Joe Colombo and this group is that 1971 was an entirely different universe than, say, 1969. Just those 2 years, like you even look at it when Joe Colombo Joe Gallo comes out of prison. I mean, it's such a different world. I think that the world had turned much more cynical against these movements. And, this is the rise of the new coalition that Nixon put together. It's I obviously didn't live through that time period, and you didn't as well, but just reading it as history, you can see that there was very clearly a break between the 60s, the late 60s and the very early 70s.
Yeah.
The world, America and the world just got a lot harder in those days.
Yeah, I think there was a reaction to like the extremism, radicalism that was coming out of the new left, and that's Nixon tapped into that, and Pat Buchanan, who was a speechwriter at the time, they tapped into that and came up with the quiet majority. And there was a lot of truth to it, where you saw some of the crazy stuff that was going on in the left, and people will push back at me and be like, oh, they were just fighting for civil rights. I mean, no. There was a lot of other really crazy stuff that was going on that was being promoted in the news and in the newspaper. I mean, I don't think nowadays people probably wouldn't think much of it. And people were sick of it and they wanted a halt to it. And that's undeniable. And even the left itself, or the counterculture movement, whatever you want to call it, once it hits the 70s, it definitely itself takes a huge turn. Not in a good direction, a much more dark and cynical direction itself, where like it felt like this counterculture movement had I get the impression that they felt like they could change the world for the better. And when it became very apparent that was not going to happen, they decided that they were going to try to destroy it. I mean, if you look at, say, Jim Jones came out of this movement, Charles Manson came out of this, the counterculture movement too. There's definitely takes a darker turn. I mean, there's actually there's an interesting book that kind of gets into that a little bit. You had mentioned it to me before. Trying to remember the title of the book right now. It's about like the use of LSD and stuff like that, and how it changed the counterculture movement. It was I'm drawing a blank right now. We'll put it in the show notes if I remember it.
Also, at that time, you look at it, the economy's taking a dump. A crime is through the roof. Just so many things that change. Like you go from maybe 1966, 67, 68, where people are generally fairly positive about the world. Vietnam takes a major dump. The economy crashes. You're seeing the really first vestiges of post-industrialization coming. I talked with a guy who was in the army, and he joined the army I think it was around 71 or 72. And like he said, the army was just a shambles. And the only reason he joined the army is because all the guys who before him who had gone to work for the plant for like essentially 4 times the minimum wage, 5 times the minimum wage to do like really menial jobs, they were losing their jobs left and right. Like all that stuff was happening right around the early, all of that was starting to come down in the early 70s. And you can see, just to pull it back together, that Colombo may have just missed that magic moment where if he had done it, started this maybe 3 years before, it could have really have caught some, really caught on to something, where by the early 70s, that was long gone.
Yeah, I would generally, I would agree with that. If he had some better timing, for sure. I mean, the entire thing that always makes me laugh about the Italian Civil Rights League, it's a civil rights league that's supposed to be fighting discrimination that's going against Italians. Yet at the same, one of the things that they pushed was like, not all Italians are mafioso or part of organized crime. Yet the guy who's running the thing is the head of a mob family. It'll never not make me laugh. Right? It's just like, it's so.
Oh yeah, it's irony.
It's just so funny. Right? It's a bizarre, like crazy story. And
you had some questions. Why don't you lay out these questions that we can put to you, the audience, and come back with us? What do you think what do you think about some of these different issues? And then, we might address them in a later episode. You leave us with these questions, Mustache, and then we will, definitely talk about them some more.
First one I would say is, was the Italian Civil Rights League a great idea that was just mishandled? You heard our opinions. We'd like to hear yours. And then the second question would be, did the Italian Civil Rights League ever have a chance of being successful? Given the fact that it was ran by Joe Colombo, who was the head of one of the 5 major crime families in New York. And what's your opinion on Joe's idea of attacking the FBI, in direct contrast to the approach that the commission took, which was basically, tuck into your turtle shell and hopefully they don't notice you. I guess. The last question is going with: was the commission right in wanting to shut down the league, with the theory that was the real reason that they took out Joe Colombo, was actually the commission that did it? Or, maybe they should have just kept it around even after Joe Colombo, after they took out Joe Colombo and they put on their own guy. Maybe they should have just kept it going. What do you guys think?
Yeah, but think about those questions. Definitely reach out to us. And definitely, if you enjoy what you are hearing, tell your friends about us so that your friends can become friends of ours. And we will talk to you next time.